Okay, everyone. So welcome to the plenary session. This is the plenary for Susan Watson. She's the Professor and Dean at the University of Auckland in New Zealand. She's going to present for about 30 minutes, and then we have some time for some questions after that. So I'll pass it over to you, Susan.
Thank you, and welcome everyone. In New Zealand, we say for our welcome, we say kia ora katoa, which means welcome to everyone in Maori or Te Reo, which is our other language. So we're very glad that you can join us today, and especially through the wonders of technology from around the world, although of course since COVID this has become kind of the new normal for us, hasn't it? But we're very pleased to have you join us virtually for the conference. I know it's been going for a little period now. We had been, of course, hoping that we'd host you in person in Auckland, but I understand that's a possibility for next year. So let's hope that we're all able to have these sorts of events in person. I looked at the theme of the conference, and I thought my area of research is companies and corporate governance. So I thought I'd talk, and then looking to the future, I thought a topic that might be of interest was to talk about artificial intelligence in companies. As you may have read or heard, there's some discussion that boards of directors, some of the directors may end up being bots or artificial intelligence, or even over time, we may have boards that are entirely comprised of artificial intelligence. And of course, that causes us a degree of visceral fear or concern. But the theme of my paper is really that it's not as big a change as you might think, because for many years with the companies that we've had among us, we've really had artificial legal persons who are entities that aren't really comprised of people. So really, it's rather than it being a major change, it's really just a kind of continuation of what we've had in the past. So it's pretty clear. I mean, the question, I don't know, when we go on road trips in New Zealand, everyone always says, are we there yet? So the question is, are we there yet with our fully self-driving corporations driven by artificial intelligence? Well, the answer is no, not yet, but it's probably close. And the definition of artificial intelligence is the ability of a non-natural entity to make choices by an evaluative process. So if you think about that definition, the ability of a non-natural entity to make choices by an evaluative process, that could really be applied to decision-making in a modern company, even though it is HI, human intelligence, rather than AI, that drives decision-making. So what causes me to say that? Well, part of it is that boards of directors don't operate with complete freedom of decision making. So given the constraints and imperatives that HI, human intelligence on boards currently operate under, will AI substituting for HI really make much difference? So that's really the theme of the paper. So we do hear more and more of these driverless corporations or bots substituting for human beings on corporate boards, with the spectre of a future controlled by entities devoid of human beings upon us. When we hear these sorts of things, I don't know if anyone in the audience watches shows like Black Mirror or Twilight Zone, but we experience that sort of visceral fear when we imagine a corporations without people, or these entities among us without people. But in fact, has the future been with us longer than we all realize? So what really is a company? There's a famous quote from a leading company law case that says, "There's no such thing as a company as such." And that's because companies are legal fictions that arise out of a form of collective imagination. Those of you who've read the book Sapiens will know that he spends quite some time talking about companies. He uses the example of Peugeot, but the fact that there's no such thing as Peugeot, the company. There's no such thing as a company. Really, they are a form of collective imagination. We have a shared acceptance that we operate like we do with money or other legal fictions. We operate companies with a consciousness of their falsity. But such is the power of this fiction, the fiction of the company, that it has been described as amongst mankind's most ingenious inventions. And that's a pretty big statement, but it's probably the disembodying from human beings that gives the company its immortality and its ability to aggregate forms of capital over long periods of time. So the argument in the paper that I've written, that's on SSRN if anyone's interested, is that artificial legal persons have long been recognised as legally separate from human beings. So the shift to artificial legal persons being controlled by artificial intelligence is not therefore as radical as it might first appear to be. Now, why do companies succeed? It's actually counterintuitive. Those of you who are familiar with the work of Adam Smith, he was the first to highlight what's become the staple for research in finance departments around the world, is that the separation of the company from its investing shareholders, known as the agency problem. So the statement, other people's money, the fact that investors entrust their money, their funds with someone else, essentially. And that creates an agency problem, a risk for the investors around shirking, misappropriation, and so forth. So that's a major issue with companies. But despite that, I don't think anyone would dispute the success of the form and the success in terms of aggregation and growth of wealth of corporations. So why do companies succeed in growing, creating value? Now, in my work, I think that it's initially that the first form of modern company emerged much sooner than is generally accepted. Probably, I would say, with all the characteristics of a modern company, with the English East India Company in 1657. And that was the point when the company was given permanent capital rather than temporary joint stock funds that traded for a short period and then were split up. And at the same time, the board, or the governors of the English East India Company, swore an oath to act in the interests of the permanent capital fund of the company, rather than following the instructions of the shareholders themselves. And what that led to is what's known as the separation of ownership from control, the separation of shareholders from the company, or if you like, the disembodying of the company, so it became an entity. So that separation, combined with the potential immortality of the artificial legal person, which can far outlast the lifespans of any shareholders and therefore their short-term concerns, combined with boards constrained to act in the interests of the corporation itself, mean that capital funds grow and shareholders consequentially prosper. The reason, of course, shareholders consequently prosper is that even though they receive dividends, which are kind of the amounts that boards will determine the profits of the company, they also prosper on the secondary markets because of the value of their shares, which of course that value being determined by the underlying value of the entity. So accepting that the role of the board relates to the capital fund in the company, rather than the directors acting as economic and legal agents of the current shareholders, provides clarity of purpose for boards. And of course, this is contrary to agency theory, where steps are taken, incentives are created to try and link the interests of boards, or link the interests of directors on boards and managers with the current shareholders. So this is a different way of thinking about what truly, if we understand what the role of the board is, that it more relates to the capital fund and the growth and sustainability of the capital fund. So unquestionably, as a form for transacting, extracting and generating value, the modern company, once it's understood that its key characteristic is that separation of ownership and control, or that separation, so it's an immortal entity from its shareholders, it's unbeatable for generating value. But at the same time, even with its current form, before we have artificial intelligence, we need a reality check around the limitations of the corporate form. So modern corporate governance increasingly focuses on corporate purpose and on societal stakeholder concerns, with the focus by investors on sustainability and on ESG, environmental, social governance aspects. And of course, that influences the weight boards put on those factors in their decision making. So it's rare now that you won't see statements around purpose, that you won't see statements around the environment, social interests and so forth from boards. But does that mean necessarily that we think we can say companies care about, say, sustainability? So boards may develop relationships with corporate constituents, otherwise known as stakeholders, and may address constituent concerns. But correctly understood, I would argue that's only as far as the ultimate end or purpose is to maximise the forms of value that are held in the corporate fund or the capital fund. So it's a kind of self-interested interest that they'll take in those relationships, in the sense that it's to grow value. So doing good by prioritising ESG factors is legitimate and will be considered legitimate and will be tolerated by shareholders, who of course have the power to appoint but also remove directors. But it'll only be tolerated by shareholders to the extent that it enhances the reputation of the corporate legal person, it encourages investment, and it maximises the value of the capital fund. Now, boards will consider sustainability issues when they're assessing risk, but if the focus of boards, as I believe it has to be or is on capital fund value maximisation, the risks of the entity brought about by externalities may be neglected and the effect of those externalities on the outside world ignored. So boards may consider ESG concerns to the extent they maximise the forms of value the corporation holds in its capital fund. But even if we accept, as I do, that they're not going to focus on short-term profitability once they move beyond the interests of current shareholders, so they move beyond that myopic focus on profit maximisation, that will make companies less bad, but it will not make them completely good. And that's because they will only take into account constituent or stakeholders' interests to the extent that it would ultimately grow all the forms of value in the capital fund, including the values around reputation and so forth that are linked to sustainability and ESG. So then, in terms of how this relates to artificial intelligence controlling the company as opposed to, as currently, human intelligence, a lot of the writing currently about artificial intelligence is saying that if we have corporations controlled by artificial intelligence, who should be liable for corporate wrongs when you've got essentially a disembodied entity controlled by a disembodied algorithm that's artificial intelligence. So the notion of artificial intelligence making decisions for the artificial legal person may compel us to rethink the roles of the human beings who operate around and behind the corporation. So my argument is substituting artificial intelligence for human intelligence will neither potentially improve or worsen the potential for harm that exists with the corporate form. And in fact, thinking about the control of an artificial entity by artificial intelligence, in fact, forces us to make a clear-eyed assessment of decision-making and liability in modern corporations, even as they exist now, controlled by human intelligence. And I would say there are three characteristics that militate against conscience and doing good in corporations. And the first is the fragmentation of roles in corporations, including the separation of ownership from control that I've talked about, and also the separation of control from implementation and accountability. The second is that moral hazard of being in a group and part of an organisation, the sense in which that constrains or affects the way in which we make decisions and we operate. And the third is the internal constraints on moral decision-making, including at the moment perceived profit maximisation imperatives, but even if we shift into the future and think about capital fund maximisation imperatives and fiduciary obligations to the company. So those constrained decisions that directors in terms of the form can legitimately make, they can't move beyond these forms of value maximisation. So then finally, where ultimately should the buck stop? Who should be liable for corporate wrongs, whether it's a corporation controlled by HI, human intelligence, or a corporation controlled by artificial intelligence? Now, there's calls for piercing the corporate veil, making shareholders liable when abuses occur in driverless corporations operated using AI. But I would say, well, why should the shareholders of driverless corporations be liable for corporate wrongs when the shareholders of corporations run by HI currently are not? In the same way, boards are constrained to compel in the active interests of the shareholders, even if we believe through maximising the value of the capital fund. But it's the shareholders who launch and then keep that corporate vessel afloat. So the property rights of shareholders in the capital fund of the corporation should, I would say, carry with them concomitant obligations. Shareholders have long enjoyed limited liability to creditors of the company, but why should they enjoy limited liability for corporate wrongs for torts and for other harms that are done by the company? In fact, the modern prevalence, if you follow corporate law, corporate ownership, the modern prevalence is of widely diversified institutional investors as shareholders. So that might make veil piercing, making shareholders liable more palatable for these sorts of wrongs. And whether it's algorithms or constrained boards of directors that govern these legal fictions, these creations of our imagination that are corporations, should not alter our requirement that shareholders, as the creators and perpetuators of the fictions, be liable for the harms that those corporations cause in the world. So in summary, the argument in the paper, substituting constrained boards of directors acting in the interests of the corporate fund contained in the corporation with artificial intelligence, so replacing HI with AI, is really an incremental change, not a fundamental change. So recognising the moral and ethical challenges with the AI-controlled corporation already exist with the human intelligence-controlled corporation may force us or compel us to reconsider the responsibilities we place on those who set these value creators and aggregators, these works of fiction, these works of imagination that are corporations in motion, and also compel us to rethink the obligations of those who perpetuate their existence in the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. If it's okay with everyone, what I'd like to do now is, if you have a question, feel free to type your name in the chat box, or if you have another, if you want to put your little hand up that I can see Spencer's doing right now, feel free to do that. So I'll just call on you, Spencer, for the first question. You'll have to unmute yourself.
Well, that was excellent. I really enjoyed your presentation. I would just like to expand it a minute, or at least ask you to expand on something. I can understand the rational decision-making process when it comes to making profit in a corporation. Perhaps it gets a little messier if we go to the nonprofit sector. And what is your perspective on that?
Yeah, and I think that's interesting. So I was very much focused on the for-profit corporation, and I think the imperatives are different, legitimately different in not-for-profits. So yeah, and in summary, this is just talking about the classic for-profit corporation. Those types of moral hazards don't exist the same way, I don't think, in the not-for-profits.
Well, I guess the reason I asked that is because unfortunately, I work for an institution which is a nonprofit institution, and I've often been told that if there's no money, there's no mission. So we tend to start to mimic the type of decision making in our boards that takes place in the corporate sector. So I guess our challenge will be to somehow keep tabs on that, I think.
I mean, I suppose also if a not-for-profit does harm, like, you know, tort type harm, there's no reason, you know, using the same rationale that the shareholders shouldn't be liable, because they're still operating the not-for-profit in the world. So I guess that, you know, you can think of it like that. By analogy, it's just that I guess the focus isn't so much, and I guess a not-for-profits trying to grow forms of value, they're just not necessarily financial in the same way that they are for a for-profit. But it's still the same, it operates in the same broad sense, doesn't it?
So I guess there could be a rational process of algorithms that could be put to use within a certain set of guardrails for decision making by the board in that particular case. Yeah, thank you.
Hi, Karen.
Hi, thank you so much. That was a sensational introduction to this conference. Thank you, Susan. As you can tell, I'm Australian, though I did live in Auckland for 10 years. So I'm very sorry not to be back there at this moment, but I will be there next year. Of course, in Australia, we've had a lot of change coming out of various royal commissions. The one of particular interest to me in relation to what you've just talked about is the Royal Commission we had into the banking and financial sector here in Australia that resulted in a lot of changes, but we saw changes particularly in terms of stakeholder movement. And our largest stakeholders, of course, here in Australia are our superannuation funds and investors. And they actually were behind the removal of several executives and board directors at different financial institutions here in Australia, including, for example, the most recent high-profile one was Westpac. So I'm interested in to hear your thoughts on that sort of relationship and dynamic we're seeing changing here in Australia. And also, secondly, we've also had regulations introduced for the financial sector, and I think this is copying what's already been put in place in the UK in terms of placing accountability on senior managers and executives, where the financial institutions are required to, I've forgotten the term for it, but they're required to name the individual managers who are responsible for certain parts of their organisation, and therefore addressing what you talked to about the diffusion of responsibility and accountability problem.
Well, thank you for the questions. And I must confess, I don't know if people know this, and probably not something I should even talk about, is that a number of the people running the Australian banks at the time this happened were New Zealanders, including Ian Narev. So it's not. We have a brochure in our business school from a few years before this happened, proudly trumpeting the fact that we had all these people leading the banks in Australia. But of course, now that brochure's been put away in a cupboard. So yeah, no, thanks for the question. Around the Hayne Commission, and I guess that perhaps relates to the point I was making, that I think perhaps there's a lot of hope being put by people on things like corporate purpose and around more stakeholder involvement, and I guess the argument being that that's probably going to make corporations behave better, but it won't make them completely good. So in a sense, it's a self-interested focus, I would say, that's been put on that by corporations, and because they are essentially, if they're for profits, they're value maximization machines, so they can see that there's value and have, in fact, there's harm to reputation as loss of value, so they will do what's necessary as they navigate it in the world to accommodate what their external constituents think they should be doing. So I guess it's just because at the moment the debate's kind of shareholder capitalism versus stakeholder capitalism, as if there's nothing in the middle, or as if there's the goodies and the baddies, but in fact I think it's a bit more in the middle and complex than that. So I think that's probably sort of a response to your first question. And the second one's interesting, isn't it, about the financial regulation that actually reaches into companies, because if we think that in fact those who control companies, directors, boards, are unable to be completely moral with the constraints they have, then that might legitimise some form of regulation that does actually reach in and lay down regulatory requirements, rather than the kind of classic arguments that they're entirely private, corporations entirely private, and therefore there shouldn't be regulation, certainly that reaches in.
Thank you.
Thanks, Karen. Our next question is from Peter. Peter, would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yeah, thanks. Hang on. My question is, Susan, can you please share thoughts on why for-profit companies fail so badly or can fail so badly in the AI, HI context?
I guess I'm not arguing that they'd fare badly, just simply that we have essentially, whether it's HI that controls them or AI that controls them, we have to be realistic about what they are. And what they are is value maximization machines or entities, and that all the arguments, and there's a lot of interesting stuff being written at the moment about how artificial intelligence will change corporations and how we're going to regulate and how are we going to control them, because essentially then you've got entities in the world that are entirely separate from human beings that amass huge amounts of value and wealth. And, you know, I mean, if you watch some of the more dystopian stuff on television, you know, we end up being enslaved by them. But, you know, and some of it's exaggerated, but I guess the argument in the paper is that it's not, we already have them if you understand what corporations are. So it's just an incremental change that opens our eyes to what's going on when we think about artificial intelligence controlling them rather than constrained boards of HI, human intelligence, because really the ability for boards to act morally does exist, but it's not complete in the way that a 360-degree human being would offer morally as an individual. So I think it's just a way to kind of look at what's ahead and then look at what we have and recognise that's what corporations are. We've had them in that form, you know, perhaps since the East India Company.
Thank you, Susan.
Do we have any other questions? Does anyone have anything else that they'd like to ask Susan? Well, we're going to be posting this online. So if anyone thinks of any questions, we have a place for discussion in the chat underneath the posting in the event schedule. We'll also be having another plenary tomorrow around this time, maybe an hour later. I'm looking at you, Elizabeth, because you remember the times. But I'd like to thank you, Susan, for your really interesting talk. We appreciate your time and it was fantastic. Sorry, things are buzzing at me over here. Thank you all. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Excellent
And
presentation.
hope to see you in Auckland a year from now.
Yes,
Yeah.
looking forward to it.
Actually,
Yeah.
because Susan kindly accepted this invitation, I know she is very busy with this kind of environment, you know, Corona and a lot of things going on here. So thank you very much. It was excellent presentation, and thanks everybody for joining us today, and hope to see you tomorrow as well.
Tomorrow and next year.
And yeah, next year, especially.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.